Thank you very much for joining us, Ms. Andani, and I'm sure that you know of a lot of the issues with regards to the banking sector as of today. Now, we've seen, one would say, 7 banks, most of which are local banks. In fact, actually, it's all the 7 local banks haven't gone down. Are you surprised at what is going on within the sector that you are the president for the association?
Yes, I must say I'm surprised. I'm surprised because the central bank has exercised over the years enhanced controls, enhanced supervision, and therefore the developments are a bit of a surprise, yes.
Would you say that the regulator is being too tough on local banks and probably should look for other ways to deal with what is happening?
First of all, let's put into perspective what you call local banks. There's nothing called local banks. The regulator, Central Bank of Ghana, licenses universal banks. So it's a set of shareholders, but the activities and controls and relevant laws are applicable to everybody. You may have local dominated shareholders or foreign dominated shareholders. The central bank does not license local banks and foreign banks. The central bank licenses universal banks or class 1 banks, right? So that's where we should start from. So we move away from this nomenclature of local banks.
Okay, then let me just say that, are you surprised at, the way the regulator has dealt with banks with local control? I mean, in terms of shareholding, Ghanaians who have, majority shareholding, kind of banks in this country.
So the action taking is not against the shareholders. The action taking is about the conduct of banking business of these licensed entities. The Bank of Ghana gives you a license, and as I said, a set of rules and regulations and performance matrices you're supposed to abide by and produce. So whichever financial institution there is, if you're not meeting those standards, obligation particularly to your depositors, to the regulator in terms of prudential requirements, action will be taken. So the action taken is as a consequence of these institutions falling short of the performance criteria set for normal banks to operate. So nothing to do with the shareholder at the stage. It is just the performance criteria which has been set for all banks. So the 7 banks that you've mentioned fall short, as the governor has said, and some of it is now public, in the conduct of banking business. So again, let's rest the shareholders.
Ms. Andani, I am looking at shareholders plus the managers of the bank and the way they have conducted themselves. Are you surprised at these colleagues of yours and how they have behaved in running down these banks?
Yeah, so again, it comes to governance, conflict of interest management, third-party single obligor limit, which is the maximum exposure any bank can give to any client, what we call related party dealings. And it should speak to the level of governance in Ghanaian firms or Ghanaian-controlled firms. So probably shareholders cross the line from being shareholder to getting involved in the day-to-day business of the bank and of the firm. And could be bank, could be anything else. Shareholders are shareholders. You put together the capital to set up the firm and then hand over the firm to competent people to run. So if shareholders cross the line, to instead of being shareholders and waiting for the firm to perform and declare legitimate dividends which will pay to you as a shareholder, and then you now cross the line and participate in the business of the firm, that like the banks, which trespasses related party dealings, which trespasses what we call single obligor limits, which trespasses just the rightness of business. That is a separate matter to be dealt with. And this is where, again, when you start to talk local banks, this is where I think there should be a lesson not just for the banks, but for all firms that are owned by Ghanaians, that we understand what the obligation of a shareholder is and what the obligation of managers are, and that shareholders is not for nothing that governance requires that you set up boards, and even prescribes on the boards who is independent and qualified to be on the board, and also management structures and internal control structures that are able to catch all of these. So it is an abuse of the way a proper institution should be run.
For best corporate governance practices, should we allow people who are shareholders to also come and sit as the managing directors of their institutions?
I think this all calls for extensive governance around conflicts of interest. And where you are the majority shareholder, it will be extremely difficult to put your personal interest aside from that of the firm. You see, so the firm is a legal entity that has obligations. And you as an individual, with your shares in the institution or the bank, have your personal ambitions. Now, to the extent that your personal interest is almost reflecting the interests of the firm, there can be massive conflict of interest problems. And it probably is prudent not to allow that. Probably not prudent to allow people with significant shareholdings to also run these institutions. However, it has to do with the level of governance around the management of conflict of interest. If you look at your Warren Buffetts of this world, they run global companies, but they wouldn't, and they have massive interest in these companies. But governance, management of conflict of interest, and best practices are employed, and therefore it's very transparent. And you don't see the personal interest overriding the interest of the firm. Because remember, in the firm, people have voted for you innocently. Depositors have voted for you innocently, and their interest is paramount. So if you sit as a majority shareholder and just looking after your interests, you might, overstep that and then impact other parties who have also a stake in the firm. So it's probably not prudent to have that situation. But again, rules must be there for managing conflict of interest and enforcing conflict of interest situations.
If you're talking about this, should we not also, or as some people have said, the central bank ought to be blamed for what we see because they also failed in their quest to enforce the very regulations that they have set? Do you agree to that?
Yeah, to some extent. And I don't think the Bank of Ghana and all the disclosures and investigations, these investigations were mandated by the governor. So if they did not want to recalibrate and reset the clock, we would not be where we are. So they actually took the tough decision to say, we're unhappy with what we are seeing. And to your point, yes, all the lendings every bank does, we send it via what we call Banking Supervision Department reports, several tens of them to Bank of Ghana. And they see the names of people we lend to, the names of people who give us deposits, and they ask us to send a whole lot of them. Yes, so they see these things. So I'm saying that the central bank has themselves discovered some of the gaps and taking the steps to correct them. The thing about banking also is that people or any contract that has minimum standards, there's a cure period. So you see somebody is breaching, let's say, capital adequacy. Capital adequacy is supposed to be 10%, and you are somebody sitting around 8%. And comes to give you, a central bank will call you in immediately and say you are breaching your capital adequacy. And they will not just take your license at that point in time. You will have a plan. So they give you time and monitor that plan. There would be exposures that they would query and probably give you a cure period. And if you're unable to correct it over the cure period, then they are supposed to take action. Whether they've taken this action promptly in the culminating the collapse of the 7 banks or whatever the gaps were, we should at least still give credit to them that it was not a third party who came and said, close down these banks. It was the same central bank, it's the same central bank that looked at the totality of the reports that they've gathered from these banks over years or 2-3 years, how many years it is, and decided that no, they had to stop the bleed and put in corrective actions. Yes.
Mr. Andani, you've been at the helms or as a bank head for many years. I'm sure it's over a decade that you've been practicing in the sector, even as an MD of a bank. And I want to find out from you, have you ever gotten to the point where, you decide that, okay, I want to just sign off a loan for a friend without it going through the normal procedure. Or probably when a loan has been given out, you call the friend and say, oh, you can pay to me, just like that.
It's impossible. It's absolutely impossible. The structure of the bank, any decent bank does not allow that. It will, even your own money, if you're going to lend your own money, prudence requires that you speak to your wife to say that we have this amount of money that comes in. My friend is broke and I need to give him. Do you agree? Prudence, even your own money. Your wife expects it or your family expects it and you're going to give a portion of it to somebody else. Prudence requires that you consult the other beneficiaries of that wealth, not to mention a bank. Bank has clearly laid down, we just don't do things by any whims and caprice. No. I mean, for us, even as a director, if I need just a little bit, I need to go through all sorts of governance. It's much easier for you to borrow from Stanbic Bank than for me to borrow from Stanbic Bank or any related party of mine to borrow from Stanbic. It's impossible. So it's clearly an abuse. It's not the way we do business. The way we do business is very, very clear. It's written in the law. What is related party, what the law says, what you can give to a related party, whether it's a company, an individual, related to any firm, the law is very clear. There's an abuse.
So from where you said, do you think that those who have done these things, especially in relation to Capital and UT Bank, there's a report that is showing that some of these things did go on? I mean, some have said these are criminal offense, they should be prosecuted, these people should have been picked by now and probably sent to the law courts and be made to answer questions. And if they have to go behind bars, why not? From where you sit, what's your thoughts on that?
There's due process. This country prides itself by the rule of law and due process. The central bank has started and come up with an investigation report, some kind of report. This will be discussed with the parties involved. And rightness and wrongness will be properly established. And again, a country like ours, we've come a long way. There is due process. I expect people to follow due process. Sometimes when these things come, I am not in a position, and you probably would also not be in a position to straightforward ascribe criminality. Let's allow the due process to start. I think we should credit ourselves as a country. We should credit the central bank for having the courage to stand on the law and to get these processes in train. And then for these kind of reports and findings to come out. Let's ensure that all the institutions involved in ensuring the decency of the law and also the financial services industry will do what is right. And there will be due process and fairness to everybody involved.
What would you say to your other colleagues who are bank managers or who are at the helm of affairs, running banks as of today? Because you are the president of the Ghana Bankers Association. I mean, with all that is happening, what sort of signal would you want to send to them going forward?
I think this must be troubling times for all of us. We are professionals. We are employed, and given a lot of responsibility. I think my appeal would be to people to act in their act within their professional instincts and stand by it and give advice. Because, yes, you're the chief executive. There might be a shareholder trying to do something. Yeah, he owns the bank. But you got to tell him this is the law. This is what is acceptable and not acceptable. And walk off if you are compelled to do something that is not right. There are avenues, for us to deal with it. There are various committees, audit committee, credit risk committee. There are so many avenues for us to highlight and invite our staff to speak up when they see things that are not according to the law. It's not just the chief executive, you are the custodian, you are the helm. And I encourage every member of my staff to speak out when they see things, and committee requires us to, report. There are so many avenues. So my appeal to all colleagues is just we got to reestablish some credibility in our profession. The buck stops with us because the shareholders the depositors, the regulators see us. And we are the ones that have been put in charge. They don't see the shareholder every day. And the shareholder may not be a professional banker. And therefore, if they have any inclinations or desires, you as a banker must be able to point out to them that it cannot be done and hold your line. And walk off if it is not, if your advice is not taken.
Now, going forward, the government has said that now the Bank of Ghana has assured that government is willing to support any of these banks in their quest to meet the minimum capital requirement. And some have said that couldn't you have done same for maybe any of the, even just the five who were liquidated? What are your thoughts on that?
I think, it's like when you go to the hospital, you get sick patients, right? But, the doctor has an assessment of, who can be rescued and who cannot be rescued. And then you take the right action. So again, let's wait and see the criteria that government or the Bank of Ghana will advertise for the other banks that will be qualifying for any kind of support. And of course, we have already seen the reports that are coming out for those banks that have been consolidated or collapsed. And we should be able to see what criteria they are using, because it depends upon the depth to which things had sunk before any intervention is contemplated.
Should we be thinking of some kind of mergers and acquisitions? We know that three banks are currently with their proposal before the central bank, who are looking at merging. Should other banks who feel that they cannot meet this look at that area?
Absolutely. In fact, and mergers and acquisitions are best done on willing party basis. So the 2, 3, 4 banks who have been pushed into this are literally pushed. The 5 banks that have been put into the Consolidated Bank of Ghana have been pushed. But the best measure is where 2 or 3 parties see synergies in their kind of business modules and say, look, if we put this 1, 2, 3 together, the answer might be 5. And that is what you set out to achieve with mergers and acquisition. You are setting out to achieve where the sum of the various parts is greater than the individual parts stand alone. You see what I'm saying? So, yeah, it was one of those options that we, even as an association, in terms of discussing it, were saying we probably needed to speak to our shareholders to consider voluntary measures. But, this rescue which the central bank has done and created the Consolidated Ghana Bank, it's I wouldn't say that's your classical measure. There's a lot of work to be done there to really make it a viable institution. But I'm sure conversations are going around with other, banks to ensure that there will be a willing party conversation so that people can see where there's synergies within their operations to pull it together and make sure that the united bank comes out bigger or better than the individual banks that were standing alone.
Any ideas as to any other, any other measures in the pipeline apart from what is before the Bank of Ghana now, from where you sit?
No, I wouldn't know, because those conversations happen in the boardrooms of shareholders, and I'm not in the boardrooms of these shareholders.
Let's look at anti-money laundering, our quest to make sure that terrorism, financing, weapons of mass distractions, these things are not financed and are not done through, the banks or any financial institution in this Ghana. I'm sure you've seen the revised regulation that the central bank has put out there. Some say they are just being too hard on the banks.
No. Look, I think we have to look at the terrorism financing, anti-money laundering at 2 levels. There's the national level consequence. If Ghana, as an economic or financial destination, is seen to be breaching international rules and being soft and weak on terrorism financing, and the global financial system can pick out Ghana as a conduit for this, there can be massive sanctions on the entire country. So this is a matter, it's not just a matter for banks, it's a matter for the financial regulation and financial regulators in Ghana and the government to take measures to ensure that whatever the global standards are for anti-money laundering and anti-terrorism financing, we as a country are seen to be playing completely above board. That's the first thing, and it's a very serious matter because it can bring massive economic sanctions on already poor and distressed situation, right? Then you have the same law at the bank level. So if the whole country is complying, but there's a particular bank that is, breaching or not, putting in the right measures to counteract anti-money laundering and terrorism financing, your license can actually be taken away. People are worried about a fine of 60,000. You'll be lucky to get a fine of 60,000. The worst is that, you are so poor at dealing with this. It's a criminal activity. It's a global criminal activity. It's a domestic criminal activity, and banks should not come close to it. And I mean, it is something that we fully support, and we've been running with it for years.
Yeah, because I have received even a text message quite recently from your bank indicating to me that now third-party checks, there's certain rules that need to be followed. But some have said in opening new accounts, now the requirements have even become more stringent.
Absolutely, absolutely. As I've said, is both a national level risk and a firm level risk that we need to be very upfront with and let everybody understand. It's our collective security.
A risk that might not impact on your quest to mobilize more deposits in terms of opening new accounts and other things?
Well, if mobilizing deposits has to do with anti-money laundering and terrorism, that's not deposit, that's criminality. Deposits, we mobilize it from legitimate firms and individuals who do business above board and are happy to sing and dance about it, and we are happy to sing and dance about it with them. Anti-money laundering and terrorism finance is always under the carpet with all sorts of, collusions and stuff like that, and you shouldn't be getting involved with that.
Let me look at Stanbic Bank, the bank that used it as the managing director. Now we take off the cap as the president of the Ghana Bankers Association. What should we be looking at from Stanbic Bank in these times where we're seeing banks talking to each other, others trying to swallow others, mergers taking place? Is there any plans like that?
Well, look here, I am very proud of what we have achieved as a bank. And they often say it's when the tide is low that you see who's been swimming naked. So you go and take the set of financials that we have, and then you'll be sure that we do have very solid balance sheet and income statement. And look at the caliber of our customer base and our staff and, our standing with regulators both here. And the good thing is that we are regulated by the Bank of Ghana. We're also regulated by the Reserve Bank of South Africa because we know we're significantly owned by a South African listed entity. So I'm very proud of whatever we've achieved at the level of governance, whether it's at the top level governance, executive level governance, internal controls. I'm very proud of what our business is in terms of our loans portfolio, our liabilities. All of our prudential ratios are completely above board. So I should say that to the point that we made, we're still looking around to see whether we have any synergistic kind of interest in the industry. And if, as I said, there's a willing party with a business that is synergistic or that will enhance the fortunes of both shareholders, we're happy to look at it.
And as far as your minimum capital requirement is concerned, you've met it. But until somebody comes, you would not go out there to fish.
No, we are out there. Number one, we've met our minimum capital, and again, just look at our balance sheet that we put out, on the 30th of as at the 30th of June. Yeah, there are some structural movements to be done, but if you look at the totality of shareholder funds, we're probably double the minimum capital that sets or that is required. Yeah, but we're not just sitting for a suitor to come. We're about growing our business both organically and inorganically. And to grow your business organically and inorganically, you don't sit down. You are actively looking and assessing and turning the oars in and out.
Okay, very finally, what would you want to say to depositors? Because so a lot of them feel that, okay, this is what is happening within the banking sector, and there's that school of thought that people might not even want to put their money in banks that are Ghanaian controlled in terms of shareholding, and that probably banks like yours are benefiting from capital flight in these areas.
No, again, I stressed that the Bank of Ghana licenses universal banks. They don't license local bank and license foreign bank. Let me make it clear. Every member of staff of Standard Bank or Stanbic Ghana today are Ghanaian. And I'm very proud of that. And I'm very proud of the quality and the professionalism of that team. And I'm sure there are several. If you look at the top 15 banks, all of them, most of them, including Barclays, Stanchart, they're all headed by Ghanaians. And the executives are all Ghanaians. Board members are Ghanaians. So let's not run away with the idea that if it is Ghanaian, it's mediocre. No. Ghanaian is not mediocre. We run the best banks, in fact, and I'm sure if you do ask Standard Bank Africa, they will tell you that Stanbic Ghana is probably one of their best run institutions, and it's all run by Ghanaians. So
but my point has to do with the banks with Ghanaian in terms of shareholding. That is why I said shareholding, not the people who are sitting as, because you are a Ghanaian and you've been very fantastic at your job over the years. We've seen how you've taken Stanbic over the years, and we see the Stanbic, which is one of the huge banks in terms of capital base and everything in this country. My question is basically in the area of, in terms of shareholding, Ghanaian controlled, in shareholding. That is where I am looking at.
Again, and we made a point again in our discussion that shareholders have a line never to cross. And if you're running as a professional banker, given executive authority to run your business, you should have the professional, acumen to tell shareholders not to cross certain lines. Unfortunately, some local shareholders, holding significant stake in certain banks have done so. It's a lesson. It's a governance lesson that should never recur, not only in banking, but in literally all other businesses. Yeah, but to your point, we just need, as a country, to learn to run very good firms. The totality of the wealth of this country, or any country for that matter, depends upon how well their corporates are run. How well those corporates are run. So it's a national requirement for us to ensure that there's very good governance. And shareholders should really not be seen. I don't see my shareholders. I don't. The only thing they see is my audited accounts. I don't know who they are. They are all over the world. And I know what my obligations are to them. So you should, as a shareholder, you shouldn't be walking in and out of a bank, and asking for things. But again, they are businessmen, and it behoves on the banker who is sitting there and giving charge to tell them what they can do and what they cannot do.
So are you enjoying capital flight with what has happened with these 5 banks that have gone down as Stanbic Bank?
I haven't seen any horde of customers running into our business to say we are running, but we have maintained a certain posture in the market in terms of who we want to bank with, how we want to bank, and the customers that meet those standards, we take them on a daily basis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Andani, for speaking to me.